Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and it's time to talk balance patches. So I did a quick survey on Discord and a poll on YouTube to see whether people actually wanted to see this or not. And they did, which is my opinions on current cards, ones that I would like to see changed in the next balance patch / emergency balance patch. And I do want to talk about the concept of emergency balance patching in a minute. So first of all, as ever, I am a Kards Content Creator, member of the Kards Contributor Program, provider of a lot of new player content, as well as some more in-depth tactical content and some commentary, occasional collaborator with other people, general cards nerd. I have 30 plus years in various forms of tabletop gaming and collectible card games, living card games, trading card games, however you want to phrase or consider them. Which is one of the reasons that I consider myself to have something of a valid opinion here. The other reason I consider myself to have something of a valid opinion here is I've done a little bit of design work in tabletop RPGs, though not in card games. So I do know a little bit about balance and mathematics, and spoilers, that's going to come up later. What my aim here at the minute is to pick out what I consider to be cards which I honestly believe are meta-warping right now. By meta-warping, what I mean is cards that are so dominant after I saw the OCC qualifiers decks that genuinely are just clearly so overplayed and used that they kind of need some form of change. And I'm not just going to whinge and complain about how bad the cards are or call out 1939 for bad development, because Lord knows I've had a number of ideas that I've put on the table or that have been published that have then come back and had to be changed. That's life as a designer. And that's life in card games. We all go through this in different card games, so sometimes, just sometimes, it helps us as players to take a minute, take a deep breath after we have vented, which we are entitled to do, as long as we keep it polite, respectful, and do not directly attack anyone, which I will always call out. Then, once we've settled down, actually think about what we want to do. So the first thing that I will say about balance patching, in my opinion, is the critical thing is you actually may think that you want them to nerf an archetype into the ground so that it's never played again because you personally don't like playing against control decks, nor do you like playing control decks. You're wrong. It's that simple. You don't, because then the game dies, because you lose a large number of players from the player base. The reality of these games is we all enjoy different things. Different people enjoy different archetypes, and the key is making sure that all of those archetypes and nation combinations and other such things that bring joy to players have at least some validity in the game. Wanting the game to just be skewed to what you personally enjoy is unhelpful. Natural. I really want to say it's very natural. We are human beings. We get emotive and we get passionate and we have opinions, but we need to learn to breathe through them, sit on them, and think about the greater picture, not just our personal preference. So, when we're approaching balance patching, one of the first things that you need to do, or at least as a designer you need to do, and players could do with learning to do this too, is check your ego at the door and then rummage around yourself deeply for any personal bias or confirmation bias or general skewing of a viewpoint and expunge it because it's not relevant or helpful. Right, you can vent about it, you can talk about it, that's very healthy. Lord knows I do. I have had some very passionate opinions on certain things that I will be talking about in this. But then I went away and sat down and breathed, and then I started doing mathematics and thinking about what I'd seen, and then looking at different decks and talking to people. Before I actually even thought about popping up and doing this. So, anyway, preamble over, my general views on what a balance patch should be. Do I think the game currently needs an emergency balance patch? Which is to say, a small, focused balance patch. Yes. Yes, I do. As soon as is humanly possible. Because currently we are seeing too thin a number of deck archetypes seeing actual play on Upper Ladder, and that's a bad sign because eventually it will filter down. In fact, having played around on my new player account for a bit just to see what was going on in the lower ranks, it already is. There are certain cards, which we'll discuss in a minute, that people are just instantly spending craft on because they're basically auto-win buttons if you play them right, and that is a problem. Although I will say auto-win is a very strong statement, and I disagree. But as long as you halfway know what you're doing, you can get a huge advantage from them. And we'll talk about that in it. Is the first card we're going to talk about is the card which I have observed to be doing this, and then the way that I want to see it changed. So, join me. It's Blitz Doctrine. This will surprise nobody who plays the game. And I'll get to my suggested change, which you can see on the screen in a moment. Blitz Doctrine is a new German one-cost order, and it says, develop a German light tank, add Contest Doctrine to your hand. Contest Doctrine, for context, says develop a German medium or heavy tank, and all tanks that you deploy for the rest of the battle get +1/+1. It costs 3. This is a special card, so first of all it is very important to note you can play this twice. That's assuming that you don't manage to clone or develop it from another form, but we'll get there. This is incredibly strong. This is stupidly strong. It is incredibly unbalancing because the value on this card is exceptionally warping. Because what this says is 4 credits, get 2 cards added to your hand that weren't in your deck, and a buff that applies to them and all of the cards in your deck that have the same type, which is most of them. By the way, if you can find the other one, that buff becomes +2/+2, and you get another 2 units. I don't think I need to explain why that's a problem. It's too strong. It is, however, a very cool idea, and I do feel a certain degree of connection to this card, because I, in fact, announced this card. I revealed this card, and I thought it was going to be incredibly strong. I've just noticed there is a mistype. There is a misspelling in my fix. Oops, it happens. I'm not going to go and edit it. I'm not that detailed. You can all add an S to a word. Anyway, if you spotted it already, well done. Anyway, so I believe this needs a change, but I believe this needs a very careful change, because the way this card is intended is to give the German Heinz/tank methodology a push that makes it into a holistic archetype. And I don't personally object to that. I really don't. I think it's kind of nice, because it makes it something that you can focus on more. It just was too strong. So, anyway, my suggested change for this card, and then I'll explain why, is to keep it at 1 cost. Fine. Choose 1. Develop a German light tank. It costs 0 to deploy this turn. Or add Contest Doctrine to your hand. Contest Doctrine is also on my list to change, and we'll talk about that in a minute, so this would not be Contest Doctrine as is. We'll get there. Why do I want to make this choose 1? Because then you're actually having to make a meaningful decision. Because this could allow you to turn 1 out a tank that has decent stats. Light tank, for clarity, the German light tank is any German tank of cost 3 or less. Medium and heavy tanks are cost 4 and above. I think heavy tanks 7+, and everything in between is medium. Would I like them to fiddle around with this and just say, develop a German tank that costs 3 or less? Yeah, I think I probably would, just for clarity, because I know there are a number of people who object to the fact that tanks which are definitely not light warfare context are included in the light tank pile. I'm not getting into that now, because that's not to do with balance patch. That's just a quality of life thing and something they should consider. This makes a meaningful choice. You can get an immediate benefit in the form of an accelerated access to a tank that you need, and you can also choose to just invest this 1 credit to get a bigger payoff later. I consider this to be pretty reasonable. But obviously the context for this is going to depend on what I want to say about Contest Doctrine. So let's go find out. Contest Doctrine a la bear. The original contest doctrine, as I say, is 3 cost. Develop a German medium or heavy tank. Tanks you deploy this battle get +1/+1. My version remains at 3 cost and says choose 1. Sensing a theme. Develop a German medium or heavy tank, reduce its deployment cost by 3, or tanks you deploy this battle get +1/+1. Why do I think this is a good change? I think it maintains the theme of the card, when you understand what Blitz and Contest Doctrine means in warfare, the difference between trying to get early advantage or foregoing early advantage. Look what I did with Blitz Doctrine. You forego your early advantage to get a greater position later. Anyway, this one, develop a German medium or heavy tank and reduce its deployment cost by 3. Permanently, by the way. This is not a you must deploy at this turn. I think this deserves to be stronger than. This can get you access to some really good tanks much quicker, which feels quite contest doctrine-y to me. Or you can choose to take the buff, which, to be honest, most people are going to take because the buff is very, very strong. But you don't get the buff and a tank, and you didn't get a tank earlier on top of getting access to this, because ultimately the second point that I want to make about this is that if you want the buff, you are paying 4 credits for no benefit other than +1/+1 to all tanks you deploy, because you get nothing from Blitz Doctrine, and then you have to pay 3 from this, which also gets you nothing except the buff. 4 cost +1/+1 to all tanks thing. There is an argument to make this a 4 cost, so it's a 5 cost order, but I am always a big fan of light touch in things to see if it settles back down. Honestly, I did go backwards and forwards on whether I wanted to change this to 4 cost, or at one point I considered altering the benefit to be your tanks get +1/+2 for the rest of this turn or something similar, so that it's a bit more blitzkriegi. You can get good trading value, also feels quite contest doctrine-y. But in the end, I just wanted to stick to the heart of what the designers have already done, which clearly they have stated in the way that they printed this card, but try and make it so that this card would perhaps not be just auto-include. It might still be. I'm not entirely sure that I've hit it hard enough. As I say, I think there is possibly a really good argument for making Contest Doctrine 4 cost rather than 3 to slow it down a bit. I know people, by the way, have also talked about not having the buff stack, but that's actually counterintuitive to the way that the game currently works, and the way to do that would be to make this an elite, and I know 1939 don't change card rarity. So again, I'm just trying to soften this. This is what I would do initially. I will say very clearly, I'm not sure this is a final fix. I think this will slow it down. I don't know whether it will slow it down enough or whether it will just be incredibly pervasive anyway, because everybody's like, I'll quite happily pay 4 for +1/+1 to all my tanks and eat the fact that I have to get hit earlier. But this makes you lose advantage against faster decks because you are having to burn a credit for nothing early in the game, as opposed to burning a credit to get a benefit later and getting a tank that you can probably deploy next turn. See how it goes. But this is my opinion. This is the change that I would make to these cards. Okay, so what's next on my list? Next on my list, again to no one's surprise, will be self-credit. But this is going to be a much more complicated conversation. So buckle up, because I'm going to get a little bit mathsy. Actually, that's a lie. I'm probably going to get quite a lot mathsy, because that's the whole point of this card package and how it works. So, let's meet the package. These are 8 cards which collectively make up the heart of the Self-Credit Denial Japan package. I am putting them all on screen and talking about them as a package because functionally you kind of have to, which is why balancing this thing is so hard. The whole point of this archetype is to lose something very important early, actual credit slots that don't come back, kind of, and to invest in a much larger payoff later. Exponential gain. Now, many of you will have heard me talk about the fact that exponential gain is a dangerous mechanic to get into anyway. But we've opened Pandora's box. Let's see if we can limit the collateral damage. By the way, is currently significant. I'm going to open up by saying, those of you who have, there might be some of you who are in this who have tried this deck or played against this deck and gone, it's not that good. The likelihood is that you have either you yourself or the person who you were playing against, if you found this an easy win, just didn't know how to pilot this deck. So this deck, when you know how to pilot it, which we're going to get to in a minute because we have to, is insane. But it is all about knowing how to take advantage of the package, because the package is, of course, incredibly complicated. But this is not only a balance patch, I suppose this is a terrifying bare lesson in self-credit denial. Anyway, let's talk about this. So the two base cards that we'll start with are the two regiments. We have 5th Regiment, which is the card that is a 4/4, and it says when you lose a credit slot, if this card is in hand, reduce its deployment cost by 2, so from 4 to 2 or 2 to 0. If it's on the board, every time you lose a credit slot, it gets +2/+2. Yes, you can, followed by the other, in fact, quite often you will. We'll get there. The other half of the unit package is 40th Cavalry, which is a 3-cost 0. Both of these, by the way, are 0 op cost. That is important. Is a 3-cost 0 op cost for 3 infantry that says deployment, lose a credit slot, which is part of what it does. It also says destruction, reduce the cost of cards in hand by 1. That will become important in a bit. So these two units are giving you the core idea of being able to early on steamroll out big units, because a 4/4 for 0 with 0 op cost, if you can pull it off, is good. And you could be playing it on turn 2, because if you can pull off credit denial turn 1 with this in hand, followed by credit denial turn 2 with this in hand, it plays onto the board for 3 at 4/4. How on earth would you go about doing that? Well, let's talk about the other cards that we've got. Let's talk about Air, Land and Sea. Air, Land and Sea is a 1-cost order that says develop a card in your deck. So it checks your deck as you play it. By the way, this means if you do not have 3 cards in deck, it bricks. Which is to say you can't play it. But it checks your deck, shows you 3 cards from your remaining deck, and you pick one to develop, which is to say you add a copy of it to your hand. Note, add a copy. You do not draw. That will also become incredibly important. 1 cost, so you can play this on turn 1, which reduces a 5th Regiment in your hand down to 2 cost. And on turn 2, you could pop another one of these. Or if your opponent's got some early presence, you could use Desperate Measures or Commit Reserves. Why would I use Desperate Measures or Commit the Reserves? There. Desperate Measures is a 2-cost order that says deal 2 damage to all enemies, lose a credit slot, really good board clear, and Commit the Reserves is a 2-cost order which says destroy target unit which has a attack equal to or lower than your credit slot. Lose a credit slot. Right. So they're removal cards that we can use early, and if we can ping off an Air, Land and Sea and another Air, Land and Sea, or Air, Land and Sea and one of these two, we can drop a 5th Regiment for free, and then the next time that 5th Regiment's a 6/6. So far, okay, fine, but we're just getting early presents, but we're nerfing ourselves for credits, so that's where we get to the concept of the payoff cards. There are 3 of them, and the combo platter is a doozy. We'll start with the E13A Jake, which is our 3-cost, 2-op cost, 2/3 bomber, an elite, and it says, when you lose a credit slot, your units get +1/+1, and yes, it includes itself. So once you've got this on the board, every time you're using a credit slot, unit on your board is getting +1/+1. Unless, of course, it's the 5th Regiment, at which point it's getting +3/+3. Just saying. The next one that we will talk about is the Great Expanse. I'm leaving one to the end for a reason. The Great Expanse says set your credits, it's 4 cost as an order, and it says set your credit slots to equal the opponent's credit slots. So if you have 1 credit slot and your opponent has 5, you would set your credit slots to 5. Your units get +1/+1 for each credit slot gained. So in that example, all of your units would get +4/+4. This is another elite, and it is very strong. However, all of these pale by comparison to the beating heart of this deck, and the card that we're going to talk about at Fix Point, which is One Roof. One Roof is a limited card, and 3 of them, and it says 5 cost, used to be 4. It was nerfed before it was even released. Draw 2 cards, gain 2 credit slots for 2 credits for each credit slot. You have lost this battle. See where this is going. So, 5 cost, you need X credit slots to gain the benefit, and it all becomes about maths and how much benefit you can get from One Roof. I'm not going to talk to you like that. Time for visual aids. Right, visual aid time. Let's talk One Roof and how it actually works. So, One Roof is all about getting decent payout for the value of the card, and the easiest way for me to explain why this is an incredibly potent tool and ridiculously overpowered is to actually show you the correct, in my opinion, I'm sure there are others who would disagree, but this is basically the optimal sequencing for playing this deck. So, all about sequencing. So your base objective is to get down to 5 credits, there's 5 credit slots, having lost a minimum of X, would have to be at least 3, because One Roof costs 5, and you get twice that back, so at that you would get 1 extra credit slot. However, optimally you want it to be 4 or more credit slots that you lost, and we'll see why in a minute. But the aim is to get down to 5, having lost that minimum. So if we take 5 and 4, that means that it is effectively credit 9. Credit 8 is the earliest you can pull this off, because you lost 3 and have 5, giving you profit-ish. Right. You also need One Roof in hand, at which point the sequence that you're aiming for is to play One Roof, which draws you 2 cards and gains you the base value. Critically, you then want to have or draw into a second minimum One Roof, because then you want to play that again to draw another 2 cards, which gives you a total of 4 draws, so you should be seeing a decent part of the tools you need to pull this off, which then gives you base plus the net profit, because you get the net profit again. Get to that in a minute. Optimally, in my opinion, you want to then play a third One Roof, which gets you a total of 6 drawn cards, and gets you a net gain of base plus a gain rather, total credit version of base plus net times 2. Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute, maths. At which point, you then want to use those credits to follow a specific sequence. Before we get to the specific sequence, let's talk about how many credits we can get on the handy table. So, I have broken this down very simply. It is go much further into this because, of course, it is possible to play way more than 3 One Roofs, because, of course, you have Air, Land and Sea, which could create you another one, and you're probably going to draw into it, or you could Air, Land and Sea into another Air, Land and Sea, which then creates another one, and then draw an Air, Land and Sea, which then creates another one, and you could play 5, and so on and so forth. But we'll get to why there is a maximum point of relevance here. The point here is, at base credit, which is to say the base turn on which you will be playing, I am not accounting for ramp. There are people out there who are trying to play self-credit denial and ramp at the same time, and I will say this endlessly. Terrible idea. It is entirely counterintuitive. It is just making something that's already amazingly good lower. Anyway, base credits 8. Obviously, you're -3 because you want to be down to 5, which gives you 5 available credits. When you spend those 5 credits, you get 6 because you have credit slots missing, gaining you a net of 1. Which means that if you play 1 roof, you have a 6 credit turn on turn 8. If you play 2, you have a 7 credit turn on turn 8. And if you play 3, you actually hit parity. This is clearly not optimal. It can be useful in a pinch, but it's not optimal. When we get to credit 9, however, giving us 4 credits to have pitched, 4 credit slots, I should say, to have pitched, starts to get very spicy. So at this point, we have 5 credits available. When we spend them, we get 8, netting 3, which gives us an 8 credit turn on turn 9. Right. However, the second 1 roof gives us an 11 credit turn on turn 9, and the third gives us 14. Fourth would take us to 17, and so on and so forth. Should you care, the net gain is effectively +3 every time you play 1 roof, which is why I've included 1 here. Get to turn 10, have 5 credit slots down, and we're into truly spicy territory. Because here, the net gain on each 1 roof is 5. So we can pull off a 10, 15, or 20 credit turn. If you push late into the game and somehow manage to get there, you can pull off a 26 credit turn with 3 1 roofs. Or, for that matter, a 33 credit turn with an extra 1, which you've probably got by that point because you've gone deep into the game. This thing has exponential gain. Great, so I've now got a massive pile of credits. Why is that good? How do I use them in a way that is actually going to win me the game? Well, that's when we get to the rest of the sequencing. In a perfect world, or at least as close as we can get to one, the sequence we wish to follow with our newly minted vast pile of credits is play the E13A Jake. Trust me. Drop any needed units you want on the board, that is things that you want to have buffed. This is particularly 0 op cost tanks. Very important because you want to be able to swing. At which point you play available credit denial cards, start reducing your credit slots even further. Yes, really. Prioritizing air, land, and sea. If you've got the extra, if you've still got 5 credits left, you really want to prioritize air, land, and sea. Because you might get another 1 roof proc. Just saying. Anyway, you aim to credit deny to as close to 0 credit slots as you can get. Ideally, you credit deny right down to 0. Because then you pay 4 credits and drop the Great Expanse, which you've almost certainly either developed or drawn into by now. And then all of your units get buffed by the difference between your credit slots, 0, and your opponents. Probably 9 or 10, possibly even more if they're ramping. Right. Note, if you have, and you should, 5th Regiment on the board, in addition to all of that, they have all also gained +1 for every credit you've dropped. That's 5 off Jake, so they've got +5/+5, except they haven't, because they also get +2/+2 each time you drop a credit slot from themselves. So they get 5 from Jake, 10 from themselves, so they are +15/+15, and then you add on +9/+9 from the Great Expanse, which means that your 4/4 goes to a 19/19, then a 27/27, and has 0 op cost. Or if you're running slow and you haven't got there, it's okay, because your Panzer 35T that you just dropped at 0 op cost went from 2.2 to 7.7, and then from 7.7 to 16.16 if you're gaining 9, if there's a 9 credit slot gap. Ta-da! And this is the issue, is you have more than enough credits to do this, at which point you have an insane swing turn. Now, I'm going to address a point that has been made. I'm going to address it in the same way that I believe J King has when someone asked him a similar question, which is, this is really hard to do in a 90-second window. Like, with all the animations and everything else, you're being slowed down. One, this is why I said there is a break point to the need to keep playing One Roof. But two, and I will say this because I've done it and seen it done, once you understand this sequencing and know what you're looking for, you can do this remarkably quickly. I have had I've had like 35 35s and been swinging on this sequence. I've seen people go bigger. Genuinely, once you get it down to reflex and your head understands what it is you need to do, it is insane. So, to those who have said for this to be even viable archetype, we'd need to speed up the animations, please 1939 don't. Not without nerfing it, because if you have enough time on this, it goes from really stupidly good to just unbelievably broken. So that's the deal. That is how this archetype works. This is how we put all of these parts together into a ridiculously impactful package. How do you fix that from the point of view of warping meta? You don't need to nerf everything. I'm going to say that again, because I know a lot of people have been talking about this and that, and why isn't this do that? You do not need to nerf everything. If you are being outboosted on a motorboat because the other guy's got a nitro unit, you don't solve your problem by blowing up the boat. I mean, you could, but it's excessive. You just move the nitro. Or limit it. That's my point. The nitro unit in this case is One Roof. It's not Great Expanse, as amazing as Great Expanse is. Great Expanse is just the finisher for the deck. The only reason that it works is that you can use One Roof to achieve an insane credit total, which then allows you to credit deny yourself back into oblivion, thus making the payoff on Great Expanse worth doing in the first place, whilst putting exponential gains on your units on the board through Jake and the fact that in the case of the 5th Cavalry, they love credit denial anyway. Right. There you go. Let's go talk about the fix, or my fix. Right. We're back. And after an incredibly complicated explanation of what I think the issue is and what I think you need to do to deal with it, we get to, frankly, a ludicrously simple fix, in my opinion. This is One Roof. This is what I would change One Roof to, and it's really simple. Literally nothing changes other than, instead of saying 5 credits, draw 2 cards, gain 2 credits for each credit slot you've lost this battle, it says 5 cost, draw 2 cards, gain 2 credit slots for each 2 credits for each credit slot you have lost this battle to a maximum of 12 credits. And we're done. Because this stops One Roof from being insane and requires you to play in bursts if you want to gain exponential benefit. Like, theoretically, you could, by playing One Roof, spending down to 5, then playing another One Roof, and then spending down, and so on and so forth. However, ultimately, it's not worth the trouble, because capping at 12 means that you'd actually have to be able to play quite a lot of One Roofs to justify going beyond it anyway. Now, This might not be a perfect solution, but certainly one roof does not become unpowerful at the end of this, but you do not get the luxury of 17 or 20 credit burst turn. Instead, you can have a much more civilized 12 credit burst. And be happy, or 11 credits, because in some cases, you might not get to 12 with the boosts that you're getting, because you have to hit 12 or above for this to hit its cap anyway. That's it. But this is how I would fix one roof and the SKD package. And then I just see how it goes. Honestly, I don't know whether it's the perfect fix. I don't know whether there is a perfect fix, but I am pretty certain this would reduce the majority of the truly obscene usage of one roof substantially. I'm not going to take full credit. Jaking has already mentioned the idea of capping, and I completely agree with him. Capping seems the only logical solution to this. Also, the cap's not fixed. Maybe you want to make it higher than 12 credits. I don't know. You can control it to a degree, but keep it at something at least moderately reasonable. Because it gets very silly, as I illustrated previously. Hopefully. That's me on changes to self-credit denial. Right, I'm back. Despite the fact that I said that, obviously, I literally got done saying that was my fix. It occurred to me, / was pointed out to me, thank you, Neil, that there are differing views on the situation with credit denial. So, wouldn't be the worst idea for me to actually address them, and why I've gone in the direction I have with the change that I suggested. So we're going to. So we're actually going to take a quick look at the rest of the credit denial pool, as it were, the team, and talk about the cards and what I think of them, and I suppose if I was going to change them. This isn't, we're not going to have the shiny images and the little changes on them, because this is just theory crafting, because obviously I focused on what I consider to be the best easy, or at least efficient now fix, which we've just covered. Anyway, we'll talk about the individual cards. So, let's go look at the rest of the credit denial package and talk about it. Jake, the E13A Jake. This card is fine. I genuinely... It's an elite. The biggest offence I can point at with this card is the fact that you can dupe it with Air, Land and Sea, but that's an Air, Land and Sea problem, not a Jake problem. Jake as a card is fine. 3 cost, 2 op cost, so it's not a particularly efficient bomber. 2/3, so its stats are okay, but nothing to write home about. It's an elite, so you only have one of them. And when you lose a credit slot, your units gain +1/+1. So this is a rolling buff that's on the board. There are plenty of things similar to this in the game, and you just remove. I'm fine with Jake. Jake does not need a change. Commit the reserves. 2 cost, destroy target unit with attack equal to or less than your credit slot. Lose a credit slot. Special card. It's good removal, but honestly, unless you're playing it late, it's not super efficient, and it's balanced out by the fact that you're losing credit slots doing it, which limits the number of things you can target with it. It is a very good way of removing guard, but this archetype needs a way of removing guard, because if you're going to play a fast archetype, you need a way of removing guard. I'm kind of fine with this card. I don't think it needs a change. I don't think it's a particularly heavy offender in the archetype, because all it is fuel for the self-credit denial. That's it. I would not really faff around changing this card, because I don't think it would make that much of a difference. You'd argue that you could make it a point more expensive, but I don't think it. Desperate measures. Sure. All I've got, really. This is not This card was around a lot before, people really valued it, people still really value it, it's still an incredibly strong card. It basically supplants Bombing Raid for the sheer level of versatility. In and of itself, the only thing I'd say again about this is maybe consider changing the cost. 3, maybe even 4. I know you're losing a credit slot though, so I do understand it, but maybe 3 would be reasonable, 4 would be too high, I don't know. Because I know in self-credit denial, you don't want overly expensive cards because you play them, and I get the balancing. But this card also just sees play in Japan aggro because Japan aggro doesn't care about losing 1 credit slot, nor does any cheap aggro deck that has Japan of any flavour in it. But it has to be Japan main, so it's going to be Japan aggro decks, whether that's classic Jagro, Jalvage, or anything similar. But this will be in. It's an auto-include, and if it's an auto-include, maybe look at it a bit. But is it an emergency? Probably not, but it is something to be aware of. 5th Regiment. So, this is a standard card. 4 cost, 4 infantry, and this is the one that is 0 op cost and says when you lose a credit slot, this unit gets +2/+2 if it's on the battlefield on -2 cost. And right, balancing this thing is an exercise in math. Because you need to understand what the general expectation with this card is. Now, the expectation is the earliest that you can play this card is turn 2. Because I know it's 4 cost, bear with me. Assuming that you can credit deny yourself twice in the first 2 turns, you're lunatic enough to want to do that, the earliest that you could play this is turn 2 for free, because it's a free 0 op cost 4/4. Odds are you're probably not doing that, because you kind of don't want to do that. Because you're credit denying yourself very early. The thing that I've heard people talk about is the buff too big. And it might be. And I understand why it is what it is. If I were to change this card, if I were focusing on changing the whole suite of cards rather than focusing on trying to just temper the archetype, which is what my original fix was about, I would make an argument that you could change this to when you lose a credit slot, this gets +1/+1 if on the battlefield, and -2 cost in hand. But 1, lots of you are going to ask, why is it not -1 cost when in hand? Because then you're probably slowing this down too much. And if you did that, you'd need to rebalance the initial cost, which might then make it just too good of a body. Because, frankly, 4 cost for a 4/4/0 op cost card isn't, like, infantry isn't terrible. The fact that it doesn't have Blitz is a little limiting, but realistically, being able to drop this on turn 4 as is isn't awful. And if you put it down to -1, then if you want to keep the archetype running with the intent, which is clearly that the archetype is quick, then you would have to drop the cost, and that's a terrible idea. So, and then designers will probably be upset with me because then it's asymmetric. Because -2/+2, really easy to wrap your head around, +1, -2, less so, I suppose. But like the sheer spiraling insanity of this with pop-off turns is something that if you weren't fixing one roof in some way or capping it somehow, which is what I suggested just, you'd have to address. As it is, yeah, I think if you cap one roof, this can probably stay as it is and be relatively inoffensive. I still personally would like to see the buff reduced, but I don't think we will. 40th Cavalry Regiment. This is the 3 cost 0 op cost infantry that's 4/3 rather than 4/4. It's the special, and it's the one that says deployment, lose a credit slot, destruction, reduce the cost of cards in your hand by 1. There is something I'd like to change on this card, but I don't think it's going to happen, and it's because I don't like exponential returns. I don't think this card needs to have the destruction effect. Because it skews the maths. Because this can reduce the cost of your one roof. Or one roof. Multiple times, if more than one of them is destroyed. So you can sack this ahead of the one roof turn to accelerate the pop-off turn. Which is one of the reasons that I'm pro-focusing on one roof, because this effect, ultimately, its biggest grievance is that the death of this card makes things happen faster. I would kind of like to see that change, but I'm not. It would get a bit vanilla, because then what would you do? Give an extra point of defense, but then it's a 3-cost 4/4, which, I mean, a 3-cost 0-op cost 4/3 is kind of chosty enough as it is, even with the deployment lose a credit slot, and honestly, I think you'd have to change the stats on it. And at that point, you might also have to increase the cost on it, and it would just need a complete rebalance. And the question is there a way to deal with the archetype balancing without having to rebalance literally everything? See my previous comments. But if there is any one thing on this card that I would change, it is the reduce the cost of cards in your hand by 1 to reduce the cost of a random card in your hand by 1. Would be marginally less offensive. You still have the same problem of potentially accelerating, but at least it'd be random instead of everything. Still, I don't know that we're necessarily going to see a change like that, but I would appreciate it. Air, Land and Sea. Oh, where to begin? Right, so Air, Land and Sea, first of all, declaration of bias. I personally have not been the world's biggest fan of the develop mechanic. Not because the mechanic itself poses a problem for me, but because of the sheer amount of it we're getting and edge cases, precisely like this. So first of all, to clarify what the develop mechanic is, just in case you haven't seen previous videos and stuff on it, and there's probably another one coming on it in a bit. The develop mechanic says that you will see 3 cards from a pool of cards. A specific pool of cards. You will see 3 from it. You get to pick one of them and add it to your hand. There are varying costs on the things that allow you to develop. Some of them are units, some of them are orders. They all work the same way. C3, pick 1. From a pool. Except Air, Land and Sea. And we'll get to why I have a problem in a minute. So, Air, Land and Sea cost 1 credit and says develop a card in your deck. Lose a credit slot. Is a limited card. Don't have a problem with that. 1 cost. Don't really have a problem with that either, because you're losing a credit slot on it, and granted you want to do that. Where this card does have a problem, although I'm not hardlining on fixing it, because I'm still not quite sure what the fix is that it says develop a card in your deck. Now, this is a whole different thing to the rest of the develop pool, because this is not developed from a pool. This is developed from a pool that you control and can even predict. And we'll get to the predict in a minute, because Air, Land and Sea looks at your hand, looks at your deck at the time that you play it from hand. So it's not your whole deck, it's whatever's left in your deck. Which, on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, does mean that if you don't have 3 cards, you can't play it, because there aren't 3 cards to look at, and it won't let you look at less than 3 of them. So theoretically, it can break. But the problem is, you've loaded the deck with cards that you want. So what this says is 1 credit, gain an extra copy of a card that you really like anyway. You add this to the fact that this can copy things like One Roof, or the Great Expanse, for that matter, if you want to get particularly fancy, although that would be kind of pointless most of the time when you get a good pop-off turn with credit denial. But the point is, while I'm not proposing we do anything about it now as an emergency, I do have an issue with this. Now, I've heard it suggested that this should just say draw 1 of 3 cards. Like, look at 3 cards from the top of your deck, draw 1, like Spoils of War. But then, honestly, would that be worth the loss of a credit slot? And yes, it's one cost less. And yes, I know this is the deck wants to lose credit slots, but there are circumstances and points about this that the balance is not. The assumption is not that this card will only ever be played in one deck, even if it is the case that it is. The design assumption shouldn't be. Just we get to the Pandora's box of self-credit denial. But anyway, do I think this card could do with a change? Yes, but I genuinely don't know what it is. I consider myself to be reasonably good at this sort of thing. You could increase the cost, which is something. But does it really matter that much? I mean, it does help not being able to play it on turn 1, so maybe shifting this to cost 2 would be enough of a change. But then again, maybe that would be too much of a nerf, and that is something that we also have to consider. But yeah, this is Air, Land and Sea, and this is my issue with it. And I do have an issue with it. Develop a card in your deck is, frankly, not a good idea to start with. But yeah, this thing has insane value. So we come to the big daddy of them all, the Great Expanse. Everybody loves to point at elites. We all do, because they are such big and swishy and powerful cards. And this is going to fall into a similar category to other cards, which is that I consider the only major offence of this card actually to be an offence of another card, which is the fact that you dupe it. 4 cost, Great Expanse, set your credit slots equal to the enemy credit slots, giving your units +1/+1 for each credit slot gained. I mean, let's be honest, that's the whole deal with this deck. This is the payoff. So long as you can't do something utterly insane with it, see my previous mathematics on One Roof, it's actually fine. It's just a big buff card. It's a big buff finisher. Maybe you could make it cost 5, which I think would be reasonable. I think 4 is very well costed for this. Just a little cheap, in my opinion. But in the grand scheme of things, it isn't the greatest defender. Like, the only thing I would change on this is the cost, if anything. Because the biggest issue with it is the fact that you can dupe it. If you are going to, by the way, continue to be able to dupe it, I think you really should seriously consider increasing the cost. But again, I've tried to focus this commentary on what I would consider to be solid emergency patch choices, because as you've probably noticed, get to the end of this list, we're actually getting into the archetype in any detail. This doesn't become a tight, focused patch. This becomes basically a rebalancing of a whole pile of cards. And we're only on Japan. Anyway, that's my only opinion on the Great Expanse. Beyond that, I personally think it's fine. I'm good. Okay, so we're done with Japan. And the self-credit denial archetype and issues. So we've covered Germany, we've covered Japan. Next on the list is another deck which is wandering about powered by a new archetype, and that's going to be Retribution, which is the use of the new Retribution pool by decks that run US cards, basically. Retribution is the one I'm going to talk about primarily, because that seems to be the one I'm seeing most often, which is US ramp, but with lots of Retribution in it. And I do understand why, because it's a very efficient way of doing it. And spoiler warning, also volume warning, potentially, I don't know, I try and control myself. This is the pool of cards and the mechanic that actually gets me most animated, in the sense of having a problem. I really have issues with the Retribution pool, and we're about to talk about why. Okay, so deep breaths, cleansing, all of that Zen stuff that I kind of need every time I talk about this, go into this. And yes, I've got a big flashy graphic in front of you, and you can already see where I'm going, because I really don't care. It's not like I've not said this before. So Retribution is a mechanic that is powered by cards that develop retributions, specifically Outrage. 1 cost order that says develop a Retribution. The develop mechanic, as we've talked about before, takes 3 random cards from a pool, in this case a pool of 12 cards, shows them to you, and you pick 1 to add to hand. So far, fine. The Retribution pool is 12 cards, as I said. Most of them are potent tools for buffing a unit, attacking or damaging something, and I'm fine with them. 2 of them should not exist, period. And I am animated about this because 2 of them are bad design. And I shall explain why, but I'm going to say it outright. I don't often say this because 1939 generally work quite hard and I appreciate a lot of what they do. In this instance, I believe the design team made 2 mistakes that could do with correcting quite immediately. In point of fact, I think the correction is very simple, which we'll get to at the end, although you can probably guess what it's going to be. But the 2 cards I want to talk about are a 1-cost Retribution and a 4-cost Retribution. Now, remember, when you play an Outrage, you can see 3 cards and pick one. Right. The first one is the 1-cost Retribution, and it is a countermeasure, and it says, when a friendly unit is destroyed, destroy a random enemy unit. As a countermeasure, I have literally no problem with this card. None. None at all. If this was a printed countermeasure in the game, sure, why not? We'd talk about balancing and costing and stuff like that, but fine. So why, Bear, do you have an issue with it in Retribution? Well, look at the 11 other cards on the screen, and this one, so take a look at the 12 pools and tell me, what's the odd one out? The Retribution cards are, with the exception of this one, uniformly orders. Keep them that way. Because that makes sense. And is easy for players to understand. Throwing in a random countermeasure because you wanted 12 cards, which I get the feeling, and I could be wrong, but I get the feeling there was a very big focus on there having to be 12. Throwing in a random countermeasure because you've run out of order ideas, I'll get to why I think we ran out of order ideas in a moment, is just pointless. It doesn't need to exist. So, remove it, or replace it with an order that does something. Right. Moving on to its friend on the other side, and the card that I quite possibly have the single largest issue with in the game right now. Really quite massively. This is a 4-cost Retribution with the single most ridiculous card text I've ever read in my life. And that's going some. Retribution. Develop 2 Retributions. Why? Why? Why do this? Who thought this was a good idea? I've seen people say you could increase the cost or something. No. And simply and entirely because of exponential value. What this allows you to do is narrow and dig the pool. Meaning that you can basically, if you've got spare credits, and guess what ramp does, that's the point, dig for really good utility tools. Just no. That's all, just no. Not do this, or develop 1 Retribution, or do a thing over here, or does one of... Just take the card, remove the card, move on. I don't care if you have to have 12 cards. Build 2 new orders. But don't have a card in here that develops more of it. Never have a thing that is created that creates more of the thing that is created that has the potential to create the thing that creates more of the thing that created the thing that created more of the... I hope. I really hope I do not have to explain why this is bad. I am, however, going to hop across and talk about why it's really, really bad. Okay, so this is Yank. I said I'd get round to why the previous conversation about the Retribution that develops 2 Retributions is really, really bad, and this is a big part of it. In fact, this is the accelerant that turns the fire into an inferno. Yank is a 6-cost US order, and it says, it's in Elite, so you only have one of them, and it says, this battle, when you develop a card, also develop a Retribution. Okay, so, something dies, or something else triggers to add an outrage. We play the outrage. The outrage says develop a Retribution. So we develop a Retribution. We also develop another Retribution, because Yank. Okay. We've now seen 6 cards. Let's assume that one of them, just one of them, is Retribution. Develop 2 Retribution. So we develop that card, which develops 2 Retributions, which procs Yank twice. So we develop 4 Retributions. Do I need to go further? I really hope I don't. This one's really easy, though, because I do have a fix for this one, and it's very simple. This is it. This is really it. Yank needs 1 line of text adding to it, and it's fine. Limit once per turn, and we're done. At this point, it becomes much less ridiculous and offensive. Because at the moment, it's insane. Because even if some sane human listens to me and removes Retribution, develop 2 Retributions, the fact is, this says when you develop a card. Not when you develop a Retribution, any card. If you run Air, Land and Sea with your Japan ally, every time you play Air, Land and Sea, you develop a Retribution. It's ridiculous. You run Brit ally and Sea Embargo, you develop a British bomber and develop a Retribution. Or you run Commandos. When you run Baker Street Irregulars, which says develop it. You see where I'm going with this. You could change it to whenever you develop a Retribution, but that's just overly specific and pointless. Honestly, it's easier to just limit it to once per turn, in my opinion. Just limit once per turn. This card's still really good value. I'm done, really. That's kind of it. I mean, alright, it's not completely it, because clearly something up, and I'm still impassioned about this. This is bugsome to me for very specific reasons. And it is very rare that I look at a piece of design and it makes me sigh. This is one of 2 things in the game right now that really make me sigh, and the other one is a completely separate video. This is just bad. It's not just unbalanced or uncertain or a thing here or a thing that, it's just bad. Just not good design. There is no need for it, so let's just... Shall we? Right. That's the US of A. That's really all I've got to say. I'm not going to dig into lots of the other cards, because for the most part, they're fine. So, 2 nations have not been addressed in my particular part here, and that's because 2 different things going on with them. First of all, Britain. Britain currently has 1 very playable deck. Brit Air is really quite good. Leave it be, please. I mean, we could look at Shark and ask the question, does the Shark maybe need to be cost 3 rather than cost 2? And I could accept that argument. We'd even have a look at Sea Embargo and whether it's too good, but realistically, there's nothing wrong with Brit Air. There really isn't. Brit Air it gives Brit 1 playable archetype, and its focus is on being able to control the board just enough to be able to get at you with bombers. If there is anything in this that causes an issue, it's actually Bomber Mafia from your US ally, and I'm not going to go into Bomber Mafia because I don't necessarily think that requires an immediate fix. Note, I'm not saying I don't think it needs a fix, I just don't think it needs an immediate fix. Generally speaking, I personally have been playing a bit of Brit Air, and I've got a very good win rate on it, and I know it is played, and I know it went to ACC qualifiers, but it doesn't do anything that I personally find offensive. Other people may disagree. They may even be people who will make a video on things that they think should change it, but I'm mostly fine with Britain having one really good playable deck that isn't Commonwealth and isn't hardboard clear for all of you people who really didn't like that, and I kind of get why you didn't. This is at least a little bit more interactive to play with if you play around a few bits and pieces that it can do to slow you down. And yes, it does utterly decimate Covert, but who cares? Because that's one bad matchup. Decks have bad matchups. Ultimately, I'm kind of okay with it. The second half of the two nations that we haven't talked about here are the Soviets. It's the Soviet Union, and I haven't talked about the Soviets in a balance patch discussion because they just need buffing, or a playable archetype, actually. Genuinely, the state of the Soviet playable decks right now is so disappointing. You could argue that there is a playable Soviet air deck out there, but you then realise that your ally's Brit and you're better off doing it the other way around. And then you realise that when you do it the other way around, most of the time you're probably better off with US ally, although there are some nice things you can do with Soviet ally, but the point is that it's not a Soviet archetype. Self-damage is still kind of out there, but it's not really that good, even with the new tank, which is not bad. But that new tank came in, but then Stand Together lost its usual big proc because there's no KV2 anymore. So, okay, it would have been nice if a replacement tank that you considered more balanced had come in for the KV2. Tokens got a nerf and is playable but not amazing. And what I suppose we could talk about Push. It's still out there, still playable, still something people don't like because it's an OTK deck. A little combo thing of Doom, and that's fine. Ultimately, the Soviets are in a terrible state right now, and that's why I'm not talking about them here, because this is not a conversation about overall, like, every card in the game balance. This is about emergency balance patching and things that I think are in need of a change, and specifically in need of balancing, which generally means balancing down, not balancing up. I could go on endlessly about cards that need balancing up, but there are so many of them in the game that I'd lose count. All you've got to do is go look in your collection and spend time looking at all of those cards that you never put in decks. Pretty much all of them could do with a buff, probably. Although, sometimes you just have to have less good cards. Right. That's me. That's me on the state of the game, on balance patching. That's probably more than enough talking from me. I've certainly gone into a few things. I have tried to keep this quite focused, because I could very easily have made a 3 or 4 hour video about this, because I can talk about design endlessly. And if you want me to, you can always ask me questions, because I live that stuff. It's good fun. But I do have specific opinions, as you've heard, and I've given them to you. As always, I hope it's useful. I hope you've enjoyed it. Stay well, be good human beings, and I will catch you next time.